What if you woke up tomorrow and every dollar in your wallet had become just paper? What if the mighty currency that moved mountains and toppled governments simply stopped existing? What if the world's reserve currency vanished overnight, like morning mist, leaving billions of people to rediscover what value really means? Tonight, we drift into a world where money as we know it dissolves, and humanity learns to measure worth in entirely new ways. It began on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other Tuesday morning, with coffee brewing in millions of kitchens and alarm clocks singing their familiar songs of reluctant awakening. But somewhere in the deep electronic veins of the global financial system, something unprecedented was stirring, a cascade of events that would transform human civilization in ways no economist had ever dared to imagine. The first signs appeared in the trading floors across Asia, where screens that normally glowed green and red with the pulse of profit and loss began displaying error messages that made no sense to anyone who had spent their lives translating numbers into meaning. Currency not recognized read the displays in languages spanning from Mandarin to Arabic to English, each phrase carrying the same impossible message. The US dollar had simply ceased to function as a store of value. It wasn't a crash in the traditional sense, where numbers plummeted towards zero while still maintaining their relationship to reality. This was something far stranger, a complete dissolution of the conceptual framework that had allowed small green rectangles of paper to represent cars and houses and dreams and labor and everything humans had agreed was worth wanting. The dollar hadn't lost value, it had lost meaning entirely, as if the collective human imagination had suddenly forgotten how to pretend that printed paper could be worth more than the trees it came from. Bank vaults around the world found themselves filled with what could only be described as elaborate confetti, billions of pieces of paper decorated with the faces of long-dead presidents, each one suddenly as valuable as autumn leaves scattered across suburban lawns. ATMs stopped dispensing cash, not because they were broken, but because the cash they contained had become as relevant to economic transactions as seashells or smooth river stones. In those first hours, as the impossible reality settled over the planet like morning fog, people stood in grocery store aisles, holding shopping carts full of necessities they could no longer afford, not because they lacked money, but because money itself had stopped existing in any recognizable form. Credit cards became plastic rectangles that beeped sadly when swiped, their magnetic strips containing information about accounts that now measured nothing more substantial than the weight of digital air. The strange part was how quickly some people adapted, as if they had been waiting their entire lives for permission to stop participating in a game whose rules had never quite made sense anyway. Street vendors who had spent decades accepting crumpled bills began asking instead for vegetables from home gardens, for hours of childcare, for songs sung beautifully enough to make strangers pause and smile. After the initial shock had rippled through the global nervous system like a stone thrown into a perfectly still pond, something remarkable began to emerge from the chaos that financial analysts would have called catastrophic if their own language for describing catastrophe hadn't become as meaningless as the currency they had spent their careers analyzing. Communities that had been held together by the thin threads of monetary transactions discovered they possessed stronger bonds than anyone had realized. Neighborhoods that had existed for decades, with residents who barely knew each other's names, suddenly found themselves organizing like villages, from centuries past, driven by the simple necessity of figuring out how to eat and stay warm and care for their children, when the medium of exchange that had dominated human interaction for generations had evaporated like water in desert air. Mrs. Chen from apartment 3B, who had worked as an accountant for 30 years, discovered that her real gift was organizing, not spreadsheets, but people, coordinating skills and needs with the efficiency of someone who understood that human resources were far more reliable than financial ones. The teenagers who had been dismissed as economically irrelevant because they owned nothing of monetary value became suddenly precious. Their energy and adaptability and willingness to learn new skills, making them more valuable than any stock portfolio. Elderly people who had been marginalized by an economy that measured worth primarily in terms of productive output found themselves elevated to positions of respect they hadn't enjoyed in decades. Their knowledge of gardening and food preservation and community cooperation suddenly more relevant than MBA degrees. Local restaurants that would have closed within days under normal circumstances when their cash flow dried up instead transformed into community kitchens, their chefs trading meals for help with cleaning, for assistance with repairs, for the simple human company that had always been more nourishing than profit margins anyway. The French bistro on Main Street began teaching cooking classes in exchange for help setting up urban gardens. The family-owned hardware store became a lending library for tools. Its owner, discovering that people were far more careful with borrowed items than with purchased ones. Schools found themselves liberated from standardized curricula designed to prepare students for an economic system that no longer existed. Teachers began focusing on skills that had always been more important than test scores, but had been pushed aside by the relentless pressure to prepare young minds for participation in financial markets that had revealed themselves to be as substantial as soap bubbles in morning sunlight. The pace of life began to slow, not because people had become lazy, but because they no longer needed to move at the frantic speed demanded by systems that prioritized efficiency over humanity. A few weeks later, when the world had begun to settle into rhythms that felt both ancient and revolutionary, a new form of economics began emerging from the grassroots up, growing like wildflowers through cracks in concrete sidewalks that had been designed for a very different kind of civilization. Instead of currency flowing through banks and corporations and government institutions, value began circulating through networks of relationship and reciprocity that connected people in ways that had been mostly forgotten during the centuries of paper money. Time banks appeared in communities across the globe, organized by people who had never heard of time banks, but who intuitively understood that an hour of one person's life was worth an hour of another person's life, regardless of what they chose to do with those hours. A massage therapist's 60 minutes of healing touch became equal to 60 minutes of mathematical tutoring, which became equal to 60 minutes of garden weeding, which became equal to 60 minutes of elderly companionship, creating economies of care that measured prosperity in terms of how well everyone's needs were being met, rather than how much profit anyone was generating. Farmers, who had been struggling under the weight of corporate agricultural systems that prioritized quantity over quality, found themselves at the center of new networks that valued their knowledge of soil and seasons and the patient work of feeding communities. Urban dwellers who had never imagined they could grow food, discovered that rooftops and vacant lots, and even indoor spaces could be transformed into productive landscapes when necessity combined with creativity and mutual support. The arts flourished in ways that surprised everyone, including the artists themselves, without the pressure to monetize every creative impulse, without the need to package imagination into products that could be sold to consumers. Musicians and painters and writers and dancers found themselves creating for the pure joy of creation, for the satisfaction of contributing beauty to communities that had learned to value aesthetic nourishment as highly as physical nourishment. Children who grew up during this transition would later remember it not as a time of crisis, but as a time when adults seemed to relax into themselves, when neighborhoods became extended families, when learning happened everywhere instead of just in schools, when work felt more like play because it was connected to immediate purpose rather than abstract profit. They would tell their own children stories about the time before the dollar ended, when people had to go to special buildings to trade paper for the things they needed, instead of simply asking their neighbors. Healthcare transformed as practitioners rediscovered approaches that didn't require expensive equipment or pharmaceutical patents. Nutrition and movement and stress reduction and community support revealing themselves to be more powerful healing tools than many of the interventions that had dominated medical practice when medicine was primarily a for-profit industry. 100 days after the Great Dissolution, when autumn had painted the world in colors that seemed more vivid somehow, as if the absence of monetary measurement had allowed people's eyes to remember how to see beauty that couldn't be purchased, a different kind of wealth began accumulating in communities that had learned to organize themselves around abundance rather than scarcity. Instead of bank accounts growing fat with numbers that represented abstract purchasing power, families found their pantries full of preserved foods grown by neighbors, their social calendars rich with gatherings that strengthened bonds rather than depleting resources. The cities, which many had predicted would collapse into chaos, without the monetary systems that had sustained their complex infrastructure, instead began reorganizing themselves into networks of villages connected by relationships rather than highways, by shared purpose rather than market forces. Vertical farms appeared in abandoned office buildings, their former occupants having discovered that growing food was more satisfying than generating reports about financial projections for industries that had evaporated along with their funding mechanisms. Transportation systems evolved organically as people realized that most of their travel had been economically motivated rather than personally meaningful. The daily commute to jobs that existed primarily to generate money to pay for the commute became a relic of a previous era, replaced by walking distance work that contributed directly to community well-being. Bicycles became more precious than cars had ever been, not because they were expensive, but because they were perfectly adapted to the human-scale distances that defined this new way of living. Skills that had been devalued by industrial economies suddenly became essential again. The ability to repair clothing, to preserve food, to build furniture from local materials, to mediate conflicts through conversation rather than legal systems. These capacities made their practitioners wealthy in ways that couldn't be stolen or crashed or inflated away. Grandparents became teachers again, their knowledge of pre-digital survival techniques more relevant than university degrees in theoretical economics. Mental health improved dramatically as people discovered that many of the anxieties that had plagued previous generations had been rooted in economic insecurity that no longer existed, not because everyone had become financially secure, but because financial security itself had been revealed as a fantasy that distracted from the real securities of community support and meaningful work and connection to place and purpose. International trade didn't disappear, but was transformed into something more like international friendship, with communities sharing their unique gifts. Coffee from mountain regions, textiles from areas with strong craft traditions, knowledge, and music, and stories that enriched receiving cultures without requiring payment in artificial currencies that had always been poor substitutes for genuine appreciation. After many seasons had turned like pages in a book written by time itself, when the memory of dollar bills had faded to the same nostalgic haziness that people felt when remembering other childhood toys they had outgrown, humanity began to discover capacities that had been dormant during the centuries when most human energy was devoted to earning and spending money that existed primarily as shared hallucination about the nature of value. Creativity exploded in directions that previous economic systems had never allowed to flourish, without the need to justify artistic projects in terms of commercial viability, without the pressure to package imagination into products that could compete in global markets. Human creativity revealed itself to be as abundant as sunlight, as renewable as spring water, as essential as air. Every community developed its own distinctive cultural expressions, its own music and stories, and visual arts that reflected the unique character of place and people rather than the homogenizing influence of mass marketing. Education transformed into something that resembled learning more than schooling, with children and adults engaged in continuous exploration of whatever sparked their curiosity, supported by communities that understood that everyone had something to teach and something to learn. The rigid age segregation that had characterized industrial education dissolved as 5-year-olds learned alongside 50-year-olds, each contributing their own perspective to shared investigations of how plants grew and stars moved, and societies could organize themselves around principles that honored both individual gifts and collective well-being. Scientific research continued, but oriented toward questions that emerged from community needs rather than corporate profits or academic careerism. Researchers studied soil health and water purification and renewable energy and human psychology and astronomy, not because they could get grants to fund their investigations, but because their neighbors were genuinely interested in understanding how the world worked and how their understanding could contribute to everyone's quality of life. Technology evolved in directions that surprised those who had assumed that innovation required massive capital investment and competitive pressure. Open source approaches to problem solving became the norm rather than the exception, with inventors and engineers sharing their discoveries freely because the satisfaction of solving problems and helping communities was more motivating than the prospect of exclusive ownership of intellectual property. Food systems became simultaneously more local and more diverse, as communities discovered that they could grow more nutritious and delicious food when they focused on feeding their neighbors rather than supplying distant markets. Seed libraries appeared in every neighborhood, preserving varieties that had been abandoned by industrial agriculture because they prioritized flavor and nutrition and local adaptation over shippability and shelf life. The natural world began to recover in ways that environmental scientists had hardly dared to hope for, not because of government regulations or market incentives, but because communities living in direct relationship with their local ecosystems naturally developed practices that enhanced rather than degraded the living systems that supported them. In the third year, after the Great Financial Awakening, when children born during the transition were taking their first steps into a world that had never known monetary anxiety, anthropologists from future centuries would later mark this period as the moment when humanity rediscovered what it meant to be a social species, evolved for cooperation rather than competition. The structures that emerged during this time bore little resemblance to either the capitalist or socialist systems that had dominated previous political imagination, representing instead something entirely new, or perhaps something very old that had been waiting patiently for conditions that would allow it to flourish again. Governance evolved into forms that political scientists had theorized about, but never seen implemented, with communities making decisions through processes that honored both individual autonomy and collective wisdom, without the complicating factor of monetary interests influencing every policy decision, without the need to balance the demands of campaign contributors against the needs of citizens. Local assemblies found they could address problems with remarkable efficiency and creativity. Conflict resolution became an art form as communities developed sophisticated approaches to handling disagreements that arose when people with different perspectives needed to coordinate their activities. Mediation circles replaced court systems for most disputes, with trained facilitators helping people understand each other's needs and find solutions that served everyone's essential interests, rather than determining winners and losers through adversarial processes. Mental and emotional health flourished as people discovered that many of the psychological problems that had plagued previous generations had been symptoms of systems that treated humans as economic units rather than complete beings with needs for meaning and connection and creative expression. Depression and anxiety became rare conditions rather than epidemic ones, addressed through community support and meaningful work and connection to natural cycles rather than pharmaceutical interventions that had often treated symptoms while ignoring root causes. Intergenerational relationships deepened as the age segregation that had characterized previous social organization dissolved into something more like extended family structures, with elderly people valued for their wisdom and experience, adults contributing their energy and skills, and children cherished for their curiosity and fresh perspectives. Nursing homes and daycare centers were replaced by community spaces where all ages gathered for daily activities that served collective needs while honoring individual gifts. The pace of technological change slowed to something more compatible with human adaptation capacity, with communities carefully considering whether new innovations actually improved quality of life before adopting them. The frantic cycle of planned obsolescence and constant upgrading that had characterized previous consumer culture was replaced by technologies designed for durability, repairability, and genuine usefulness rather than market penetration and profit generation. Cultural exchange became richer and more meaningful as communities developed distinctive identities while remaining open to learning from each other, sharing innovations and art forms and wisdom practices that enhanced everyone's understanding of what it meant to be human on a planet that offered infinite opportunities for exploration and growth. A decade after currency had revealed itself to be as substantial as shadow puppets on cave walls, the children who had grown up in the post-monetary world began reaching adolescence with perspectives that astonished the adults who remembered the previous era. These young people approached problems with a creativity unconstrained by assumptions about what was financially possible or economically viable, asking instead what would be most beneficial for their communities and most interesting to explore and most likely to contribute to the flourishing of all life on their shared planet. Their approach to learning was unlike anything previous educational systems had produced. Without the pressure to compete for limited positions in hierarchical economic structures, without the need to accumulate credentials that could be converted into earning potential, they explored knowledge with the pure curiosity of scientists and artists who were driven by wonder rather than external rewards. They studied mathematics because patterns fascinated them, investigated history because they wanted to understand how their elders had arrived at current circumstances, learned languages because they were curious about different ways of thinking about reality. Romance and friendship evolved into something more honest and less transactional as people formed relationships based on genuine affinity and mutual support rather than economic security or social status. Without the complications of financial dependency or the pressure to find partners who could contribute to household income, people discovered they could choose companions based on compatibility and shared values and the simple joy of each other's company. Parenting transformed as communities took collective responsibility for nurturing all children, with biological parents serving as primary caregivers while being supported by networks of adults who contributed different skills and perspectives to each child's development. Children grew up knowing they were valued not for their potential economic productivity, but for their inherent worth as human beings, developing confidence and creativity that flowered in ways that surprised even the most optimistic child development specialists. Art and music and literature flourished in every community as people discovered that creative expression was not a luxury reserved for a professional elite, but a natural human capacity that enriched daily life when it was cultivated and celebrated. Every neighborhood had its poets and painters and musicians, its storytellers and dancers and craftspeople, its inventors and gardeners and cooks who approached their work with the same creative spirit that had once been confined to galleries and concert halls. Physical health improved dramatically as people's daily activities became more aligned with human evolutionary needs, more walking and physical labor, more time outdoors, more connection to natural cycles, more variety in movement, and diet and social interaction. The epidemic levels of diabetes and heart disease and depression that had characterized previous generations began to seem like historical curiosities rather than inevitable aspects of human existence. Work became play, became service, became art as the artificial distinctions between these activities dissolved into something more like continuous, creative contribution to community well-being. 15 years into this economic renaissance that economists would struggle to categorize using their previous analytical frameworks, humanity began to rediscover capacities that had been latent during the centuries when most human energy was devoted to generating and managing abstract wealth rather than creating concrete abundance. Communities that had initially formed out of necessity evolved into something that resembled extended families, with bonds of mutual care and shared purpose that made previous social structures seem lonely and artificial by comparison. The distinction between work and leisure dissolved as people engaged in activities that contributed to community well-being while expressing their individual gifts and interests. The baker, who had once worked for wages to purchase food, began baking because feeding neighbors was deeply satisfying, creating breads and pastries with artistry and attention that transformed daily sustenance into a form of love made edible. The teacher who had once struggled with standardized curricula designed to prepare students for economic roles that no longer existed began facilitating learning experiences that helped young people discover and develop their unique capacities while contributing to collective knowledge. Technology continued to advance, but in directions that served human flourishing rather than market expansion. Engineers designed tools that lasted for generations rather than becoming obsolete within years. Computer programmers created systems that enhanced community coordination and knowledge sharing rather than capturing user attention for advertising revenue. Medical researchers focused on understanding health and prevention rather than developing treatments for profitable diseases. International relationships transformed as communities around the world discovered they could collaborate and share resources without the complications of currency exchange rates and trade balances and debt structures that had dominated previous global interactions. Climate change began to reverse as local economies eliminated the need for long-distance transportation of goods that could be produced more sustainably by people who would use them, while reforestation and regenerative agriculture expanded as communities discovered that caring for their local environments was more rewarding than extracting resources for distant markets. Travel became more meaningful as people journeyed to learn from other communities rather than to consume exotic experiences, staying longer in fewer places, developing relationships that enriched both visitors and hosts, while sharing knowledge and skills that benefited everyone involved. The tourism industry that had commodified cultural exchange was replaced by networks of hospitality that welcomed genuine cultural exchange. Governance evolved into forms that resembled democracy more than previous systems that had called themselves democratic while being dominated by monetary influences. Communities made decisions through processes that ensured everyone's voice was heard and considered, with outcomes that reflected collective wisdom rather than the preferences of those who could afford the most political influence. Mental health became a community concern rather than an individual problem, with social structures that supported emotional well-being and conflict resolution and personal growth as naturally as previous systems had supported economic growth and competitive advantage. 2 decades after the dollar had dissolved like sugar in rain, revealing itself to have been an elaborate, collective agreement about the nature of value that humans could apparently agree to change as easily as they had once agreed to accept. The generation that had never known monetary anxiety began to explore questions that previous civilizations had never had the luxury to investigate deeply. Without the constant pressure to generate income and manage financial obligations, without the artificial scarcity created by economic systems that required some people to lack what they needed so that others could profit from providing it. Human consciousness began to expand in directions that philosophers had imagined but never seen implemented on societal scales. Research into human potential flourished as communities discovered that most of the limitations they had assumed were natural were actually products of systems that channeled human energy toward narrow economic functions rather than allowing the full spectrum of human capacities to develop. Children who grew up with abundant time for play and exploration and creative expression developed cognitive abilities that made their elders wonder what previous generations might have accomplished if they hadn't spent their developmental years preparing for economic roles that channeled their gifts in artificially restricted directions. Artistic collaboration reached new heights as creators worked together without needing to establish ownership of intellectual property or compete for market share or worry about commercial viability. Musicians composed symphonies that evolved over months as different performers added their own voices. Painters created murals that covered entire neighborhoods with stories that reflected the dreams and histories of everyone who lived there. Writers developed epic tales that incorporated the experiences and wisdom of whole communities. Scientific research accelerated as knowledge became truly open source, with researchers around the world sharing discoveries instantly and building on each other's work without the artificial delays created by patent systems and academic competition. Breakthroughs in understanding consciousness and health and ecological systems emerged from collaborations that would have been impossible when research was driven by the need to generate profitable applications rather than pure curiosity about how reality worked. Spiritual practices deepened as people discovered they had time and mental space for contemplation and meditation and exploration of meaning that went beyond survival and material accumulation. Without the anxiety and time pressure that had characterized previous daily life, people began to experience states of consciousness that mystics had described, but that had been accessible only to those who could afford to withdraw from economic participation. Conflict between communities became rare as local abundance eliminated the need to compete for resources, while communication technologies that prioritized genuine connection over profit-driven engagement helped different groups understand each other's perspectives and find mutually beneficial solutions to shared challenges. The natural world began to flourish in ways that ecologists had hardly dared hope for, as human communities developed lifestyles that enhanced rather than degraded the ecosystems that supported them, creating abundance for all species rather than extracting resources that would leave depleted landscapes for future generations. In the timeless space that followed, when the concept of decades had become as quaint as the concept of dollars, when human communities had settled into rhythms that felt both ancient and eternally renewed, something unprecedented in recorded history began to emerge from the collective human experience. People who had grown up without ever experiencing economic anxiety, who had never known what it felt like to worry about having enough money to meet their basic needs, developed forms of consciousness that previous generations would have recognized as the enlightened states that spiritual traditions had described as the highest human potential. These were not superhuman abilities in any mystical sense, but simply the natural flowering of human capacities when they were not constrained by systems that required most people to spend most of their time and energy on economic survival rather than personal and collective development. Creativity became as natural as breathing. Problem solving became a form of play. Learning became a lifelong adventure that never lost its sense of wonder and discovery. Communities developed their own unique expressions of human potential, each one exploring different aspects of what became possible when people were free to develop their gifts without needing to justify them in terms of economic utility. Some communities became renowned for their musical innovations, others for their approaches to conflict resolution, others for their integration of technology and ecology, others for their explorations of consciousness and healing. Children born into this world would grow up taking for granted capacities that previous civilizations had considered miraculous: the ability to learn languages effortlessly through community immersion, to develop artistic skills through play and experimentation rather than formal instruction, to understand complex systems through direct participation rather than abstract study, to resolve conflicts through communication skills that honored everyone's essential needs. The pace of life slowed to match human biological rhythms rather than the artificial acceleration demanded by systems focused on maximizing economic output. People woke when their bodies felt rested, ate when they were hungry, worked when they felt energetic, rested when they needed restoration, creating natural cycles that supported health and creativity and sustainable productivity. Global coordination became possible through communication technologies that connected communities worldwide while preserving local autonomy and cultural distinctiveness. Challenges that affected multiple regions could be addressed through collaborative problem solving that drew on the diverse wisdom and resources of many communities without requiring centralized control or monetary incentives. Art and science and spirituality began to merge into integrated approaches to understanding and enhancing life, with researchers and artists and contemplatives working together to explore questions about the nature of consciousness and reality and human potential that transcended the artificial boundaries between disciplines that had characterized previous academic institutions. The distinction between individual and collective well-being dissolved as people discovered that their own flourishing was intimately connected to the flourishing of their communities and ecosystems, creating feedback loops of mutual support and enhancement that made competition and exploitation not just unnecessary, but literally inconceivable to minds shaped by abundance rather than scarcity. In the space beyond time, where this transformed humanity existed, where the measuring of progress in financial terms had become as obsolete as measuring distance in dragon lengths, something extraordinary began to emerge from the depths of human potential that had been waiting for conditions that would allow it to flourish. Communities that had learned to organize themselves around principles of mutual aid and creative expression began to develop collective intelligence that transcended anything previous civilizations had achieved, not through technological enhancement, but through the simple process of allowing human consciousness to develop without the constraints of economic competition and artificial scarcity. Decision-making evolved into forms that honored both individual wisdom and collective insight, with communities developing processes that could integrate the perspectives and needs of every member while arriving at solutions that served the highest good of all. These were not lengthy, bureaucratic procedures, but organic conversations that flowed like music, with each voice contributing its unique note to harmonies that emerged spontaneously from the interaction of diverse perspectives, united by shared values and mutual care. Healing became a community art as people discovered that most physical and emotional ailments were symptoms of disconnection from natural rhythms and supportive relationships rather than isolated medical conditions requiring expert intervention. Health was maintained through lifestyles that supported natural well-being, meaningful work, creative expression, physical movement, time in nature, strong social bonds, spiritual practices that connected people to larger sources of meaning and purpose. Education transformed into something that resembled natural learning more than formal schooling, with people of all ages engaged in continuous exploration of whatever captured their curiosity, supported by communities that understood that everyone had something to teach and something to learn. The artificial separation between teachers and students dissolved as people discovered that learning happened most effectively through collaborative investigation and mutual mentorship. Technology continued to advance, but in directions that enhanced human capacity rather than replacing it, that strengthened community bonds rather than isolating individuals, that worked with natural systems rather than against them. The frantic pace of innovation that had characterized previous eras was replaced by thoughtful development of tools that genuinely improved quality of life for everyone, rather than generating profits for a few. Cultural expression reached new heights as communities developed distinctive artistic traditions while remaining open to influence and inspiration from other cultures, creating a global tapestry of human creativity that was simultaneously diverse and harmonious. Music and visual arts and literature and dance flourished in every community, with creative expression understood as a basic human need rather than a luxury reserved for a professional elite. Conflict resolution became a highly developed art as communities learned to address disagreements and tensions through processes that strengthened relationships rather than determining winners and losers, with skilled facilitators helping people understand each other's deeper needs and find solutions that honored everyone's essential interests. Beyond the horizon of what previous human imagination had been able to envision, when communities had learned to function as extended organisms of mutual care and creative collaboration, humanity began to rediscover its relationship with the natural world in ways that indigenous cultures had maintained for millennia, but that industrial civilization had nearly forgotten entirely. The artificial separation between human communities and ecological systems dissolved as people realized that their own well-being was inseparable from the health of the soil and water and air and all the other species that shared their local environments. Permaculture became not just an agricultural technique, but a way of thinking about all human activities, with communities designing their social and economic and technological systems to work with natural cycles and enhance ecological health rather than depleting resources for short-term human benefit. Food forests replaced lawns and vacant lots, creating productive landscapes that provided nutrition while supporting biodiversity and improving soil and water quality, and creating habitat for countless other species. Architecture evolved to become truly ecological, with buildings designed to enhance their local environments rather than dominating them, using local materials and natural energy flows, and integrating seamlessly with the landscape in ways that made them feel like natural outgrowths of place rather than impositions upon it. Homes became expressions of their inhabitants' creativity and values, while serving as functional components of larger community systems. Transportation systems became unnecessary for most daily activities as communities redesigned themselves to provide everything people needed within walking or cycling distance, while longer distance travel became less frequent but more meaningful, focused on cultural exchange and learning rather than business or consumption. The infrastructure of highways and airports that had connected distant places while fragmenting local communities was gradually transformed into networks of green corridors that supported wildlife movement and local food production. Governance evolved into forms that resembled natural systems more than hierarchical institutions, with decision-making processes that emerged organically from community needs and values rather than being imposed by external authorities. Leadership became a fluid function that rotated among community members based on expertise and interest rather than a permanent position associated with power and privilege. The global coordination that was necessary to address challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss happened through networks of local communities rather than international institutions, with solutions emerging from the accumulated wisdom of people who lived in direct relationship with the problems they were solving, rather than from distant experts who understood issues primarily through abstract data. Mental and emotional health flourished as people rediscovered their connection to natural cycles and seasonal rhythms, spending time outdoors daily, eating food grown in healthy soil, drinking pure water, breathing clean air, and living in communities that supported their authentic expression and personal growth, while providing security and belonging in the eternal present where this transformed humanity had learned to dwell, where the anxiety of future financial security and the regret of past economic decisions had dissolved into the peaceful awareness of abundance that existed in every moment when consciousness was aligned with love and creativity and service. People began to understand that the collapse of the dollar had not been a crisis but a liberation, the removal of artificial constraints that had prevented human civilization from developing its full potential for beauty and wisdom and mutual care. Children who had never known a world where some people lacked basic necessities while others accumulated far more than they could ever use, grew into adults who approached every challenge with the assumption that solutions existed that could serve everyone's needs, who saw problems as opportunities for creative collaboration, rather than competitions where some would win and others would lose. Their approach to life was characterized by a confidence and generosity that transformed everything they touched. The arts reached levels of sophistication and emotional depth that previous generations had achieved only in rare masterpieces. But these achievements were no longer exceptional. Every community had its composers and painters and writers and dancers and craftspeople who created beauty as naturally as gardens created flowers, understanding artistic expression as a form of community service that nourished souls and strengthened social bonds, while celebrating the unique gifts of each creator. Scientific research accelerated beyond anything previous civilizations had achieved, not because of increased funding or technological advancement, but because researchers could focus entirely on understanding and improving life rather than competing for grants or developing applications that could be sold for profit. Open collaboration and immediate sharing of discoveries created exponential advancement in fields ranging from health and ecology to consciousness studies and space exploration. Spiritual development became a natural part of daily life as people discovered they had time and mental space for contemplation and meditation and exploration of consciousness that went far beyond the survival anxieties that had consumed previous generations. Without the constant pressure of economic obligations, people could explore questions of meaning and purpose and their relationship to the larger mysteries of existence. International relationships evolved into something that resembled friendship between communities rather than competition between nation-states, with different regions sharing their unique gifts and learning from each other's innovations while maintaining their distinctive cultural identities. Wars became literally unthinkable as communities discovered that cooperation produced better outcomes for everyone than any form of conflict or exploitation. The natural world began to flourish in ways that brought tears of joy to the eyes of ecologists who remembered the devastating trends of previous decades as human communities learned to live in ways that enhanced rather than depleted the ecosystems that supported all life on Earth. Species that had been endangered began to recover, forests expanded, waters became cleaner, and the atmosphere gradually returned to composition that supported climate stability. And so, we arrive at the gentle conclusion of this alternative history, this dream of what might emerge when humanity learns to measure wealth in terms of well-being rather than accumulation, when communities organize themselves around abundance rather than scarcity, when every person is valued for their inherent worth rather than their economic productivity. In this world, where the dollar had dissolved like mist in morning sunlight, revealing itself to have been nothing more than a shared agreement that humans could apparently agree to change, civilization had discovered forms of organization that seemed both revolutionary and completely natural, like remembering something important that had been temporarily forgotten. The children playing in community gardens that had once been parking lots, the adults engaged in meaningful work that contributed directly to their neighbors' well-being, the elderly people sharing their wisdom in intergenerational gatherings that strengthened social bonds. All of these had emerged not from careful planning, but from the organic process of humans rediscovering what it meant to be a social species evolved for cooperation and creativity and mutual care. In their evening gatherings, when communities came together to share food and music and stories, people would sometimes discuss the old days when their ancestors had devoted most of their life energy to earning and spending money that existed primarily as numbers in computer systems, when artificial scarcity had created competition and anxiety even in situations where actual abundance was possible. These conversations were not filled with nostalgia for a lost golden age, but with curiosity about how their ancestors had managed to function within systems that seemed so contrary to human nature. They studied the history of monetary civilization the way archaeologists might study the customs of an extinct culture, trying to understand how intelligent, creative people had convinced themselves that pieces of paper decorated with faces of dead politicians could be worth more than the living relationships and natural abundance that surrounded them. But their primary focus was not on the past, but on the continuous present moment, where life was always offering new opportunities for growth and service and creative expression. They had learned to live in the eternal now, where abundance was always available, to those who knew how to recognize and receive and share it, where wealth was measured in terms of how deeply they could love and how skillfully they could contribute to the flourishing of all life. As we drift toward sleep, carrying this vision with us into the realm of dreams, where all possibilities exist simultaneously, we might remember that the systems that currently organize human civilization are not natural laws, but collective agreements that can be changed as easily as they were originally created. The dollar exists only because people agree to believe in it, and that agreement could dissolve as quickly as morning frost when sunlight reveals the abundance that was always present underneath the artificial constructions of scarcity and competition. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will walk through communities where work feels like play because it serves purposes that matter, where conflicts are resolved through conversations that strengthen relationships, where children grow up knowing they are valued for who they are rather than what they might produce, where elders are honored for their wisdom rather than marginalized for their economic irrelevance. Perhaps you will wake tomorrow with the memory of how it feels to live in a world where wealth is measured in terms of well-being, where technology serves human flourishing rather than profit extraction, where the natural world is treated as a partner rather than a resource to be exploited, where every person has access to everything they need to develop their gifts and contribute to their community's prosperity. And perhaps, in carrying that memory with you through your daily activities, you will become one of the seed planters, one of the bridge builders, one of those who help create the conditions where humanity can remember what it means to organize civilization around love and creativity and mutual care rather than competition and accumulation and artificial scarcity. Perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll dream of communities where abundance flows through relationships rather than bank accounts, where your worth is measured in love given rather than dollars earned. Perhaps you'll wake, remembering that the systems organizing our world are just agreements we can change, like switching from a game of competition to a dance of cooperation. Sweet dreams, abundant soul. Like if you believe in true wealth, subscribe for more visions of possibility.